Episode number 354, Both and Maximizing Hybrid Worship Experiences with Jason Moore. Let's do it.
This is the definitive podcast for helping you plan, create, and execute dynamic worship experiences at your church. Useful, practical content in the areas of production, worship, communications, first impressions, and more. This is Making Sunday Happen.
Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here. This week, I welcome back to the show my friend Jason Moore. Jason has a new book out called Both and Maximizing Hybrid Worship Experiences for In-Person and Online Engagement. Jason and I have been teaching a lot of this same material over the last couple of years at workshops, online, and in other venues. We have a lot of the same views and thinking around hybrid worship experiences. I'm a both and guy. I believe that we should have great in-person gatherings. I also believe that we should have great online gatherings as well. Steve Dirks and I, Steve from our team, we both wrote a book called The Church Online Guide, all about how to create incredible online worship experiences, everything that you need for an online worship experience. We also believe in the in-person gathering. We don't think that we should forsake the gathering of believers. So I'm a firm believer in both an in-person worship service and also a great online experience as well. And there's different approaches to doing hybrid worship. There's the straight live stream, camera in the back of the room. Then there's also the pre-produced online experience where everything is shot and edited together and then aired back, nicely produced piece. And then there's a mixture of both. You can do a little bit of live and a little bit of pre-recorded and kind of mix the two. So Jason and I will dive into each of those and walk through advantages and disadvantages of all of those approaches and more today.
Hello, my name is Jason Moore, and I'm excited to tell you about my new book, Both and Maximizing Hybrid Worship for In-Person and Online Engagement. When the global pandemic hit in March of 2020, everything about the way we engage in ministry changed. With our buildings no longer available to us, we had to navigate how to translate worship for a congregation not gathered in a physical space. And while some of us were online prior to the pandemic, many jumped online for the very first time. Much like a book has to be reimagined to become a film, worship too needed some reimagining. The truth is, many churches adapted well and even embraced the moment. It was like witnessing Gutenberg fire up his press for the very first time. But as the transition back to in-person began, many churches lost something along the way. After many months of preaching directly to the people online, we reopened our buildings and people started coming back. Some treated their congregations like a studio audience, while many turned their online congregation into watchers of worship rather than worshipers online. Now, you may think it's impossible to worship online and in person at the same time, but I'm here to tell you it's not. In the book, I make the case that no one should feel like an afterthought in our hybrid worship. Not people in the room, nor people at home. Like Paul's hybrid ministry expressed through in-person preaching and letters written from a distance, today's church can lean into and reclaim the power of a hybrid approach to ministry. This book will help you navigate this new ministry landscape we find ourselves in, regardless of your church size, tech savvy, and financial means. It's the result of 2 years of hands-on, proven, real-world strategies and my work as a coach, consultant, and trainer. Pick up your copy today and lean into this fresh both-and movement of the Spirit.
Hey guys, author, speaker, and worship coach Jason Moore is passionate about helping the church reach the culture that we live in. He's known for his pioneering work in collaborative worship design, media production, and secret worshiper consultations. No stranger to this podcast. Jason, welcome, man. Thanks for hanging out.
Carl, it is good to be back. Good to be with you.
I know, man. It's been a while. I think we just need to be, on a recurring schedule with you. In fact, making a note that you're going on the payroll. next time, as many times as you've been
I'm
on.
okay. I'm okay with both those things. I enjoy spending time with you, and I enjoy being on the payroll. So either one is both are fine.
Thanks, man. Well, my joke is I always tell people that I went into ministry for the money, and I know
Yes.
that you did as well.
Oh man, I mean,
So-
I've got stacks and stacks of it because I'm in ministry.
Right. Wealth. That's it. Yeah. Right. All right. So, man, out of a lot of people in our industry and kind of our circles, I think that you and I, especially in this world of hybrid worship experiences, both and, man, we are kindred spirits in this. But you trademarked the term, you wrote the book, so I'll leave my jealousy at the door. But man, tell me a little bit about so last time you were on, we talked about from franchise to local dive, really about multi-site work. And that kind of morphed into, obviously pandemic hit, but that kind of morphed into you dealing with hybrid worship and this both and subject. So get us in here. Tell me how the book and the courses came about for you.
Well, let me tell you first that the worst thing you can do is try and put a new book out during a pandemic. Franchise to local dive, I think our official launch date was April 1st of 2020. So that's like right when everything hit. So I think that book never really found the audience that we hoped that it would have. Interesting thing is the co-author Rosario Picardo and I had driven all over the country and done a bunch of interviews with people, and we didn't even get to really put them out because everything had changed and it just didn't feel as relevant to stick those things out there and all that. So anyway, interesting side note. I had to pivot the way the rest of the world had to pivot. I had a week where in about 3 days, I had 6 events canceled from all over the country where I was supposed to go speak and all of that. And I literally said to my wife, I don't know what we're going to do. My income is derived from doing in-person consultations and speaking engagements and all that. And I guess it was like the second week of the pandemic. So it was like they had shut us down 1 week, and maybe the Monday or Tuesday after that, I had a pastor call me who I had done some in-person work with, did a secret worshiper consultation where I basically just went and gave feedback on what they were doing. And he said, we implemented so much of what you told us, but now we can't be in our buildings. And even though they were online before the pandemic, he said, we need your help in trying to figure out what we need to do to connect with people now that we're only online. So he said, would you secret worship our online experience? And I was like, sure. Truth is, I had nothing else going on. So I did that Sunday. I worshiped with them live, and I took 2 pages of notes, shared them with the pastor, and realized in sharing those notes with him that so much of what I had to share with him really applied to every church that had just jumped online for the very first time. And so I wrote a quick I asked the pastor's permission. I said, do you mind if I write a little article on what I learned in worshiping with you? And he was like, no, go ahead. So I made him anonymous. I wrote a little article called 5 Ways to Improve Your Stream Before Next Sunday. It kind of went viral, and all of a sudden, like 1 day later, I got a call from some of the Methodists over in Pennsylvania. The Susquehanna Conference of the Methodist Church is the name of the conference, this region. And they said, hey, we read that article. Could you do a webinar for us? And the truth is, I had never really done a webinar. I mean, I had been a guest presenter on someone else's webinar, but I had never really gotten into webinars. And while I had a Zoom account, I mean, I'd use Zoom like once a quarter or something, for a virtual meeting. It's funny because now we live on Zoom. So I said, yeah, let me explore it. Started playing around with this concept of a webinar. The next day, the third day after I wrote the article, another conference called, said, hey, could you turn that into a training? I said, I'm working on it. Then another one. And over the course of 5 days, 14 annual conferences, which are like Methodist regions, usually statewide, had me do this training, and everybody wanted it before Easter. And so I started doing trainings 2 and 3 days a week for a couple of weeks. And I thought, wow, that was a fun run. And people kept booking and kept saying, will you help us? And that was a training. Actually, I think you and I did a conversation about it, telling the old story in a new time.
Oh, yeah.
And in the fall, I had an ecumenical organization who had me do that training, and they were interested in doing a training on my book, Franchise to Local Dive. And in the conversation, the director of their education program said, how many of those trainings have you done now? And I said, I think I'm up to like 25 or something. And he's like, that's great. And I said, my problem is I'm really concerned about what happens when we come back to the building, because I've been teaching people how to do online only worship. And when you come back to the building, you can't just do what you did online. And you also can't revert back to what you did pre-pandemic. I think we actually woke people up to what it feels like to be talked to and engaged when we were all at home. Even the churches that were online before and doing it well, they began talking to the camera and using chat and doing things that they really didn't maybe do as much. And so I said, we've got to figure out how to do this in a both and kind of way. And that was just an off the cuff comment. And he said, I want you to do that training for us. I'll book 2 of them right now. Can you create a training for that? And I was like, yeah, sure. Yeah. And then I had to figure it out. So I had from September to November to create this new training called Bothand, Maximizing Hybrid Worship for In-Person and Online Experiences or Audiences. And I've done that one now about 95 times since December of 2020. And then decided to write a book on it and talk to my former business partner is a publisher now. And while I've done 11 other books, this one I wanted to try something a little different, one with this different publisher, and they've been great to work with. And then as a result of the release, it's been kind of crazy. It's been in the number 1 or 2 in 3 categories on Amazon, preaching, discipleship, and evangelism. For the first 2 weeks, it was in the number 1 or 2 spot. It's still in the top 100, and last week it was at number 10 in preaching. So it's been a whirlwind. That's probably a longer answer than you needed, but it's been a whirlwind of crazy things.
Yeah, man, I love following what you're doing, and we're in the same circles online and that. And man, I'm cheering you on, because this is right in the river of what we do at 1230 as well. So let's kind of jump into some content of the book. So let's define some terms. You kind of break the book up into 3 sections. It's kind of pre-Bothand worship, real-time Bothand worship, and then post Bothand worship. So yes, before we kind of get going on all 3 of those, let's define those terms a little bit for us.
Sure. I think a lot of folks think that when you are talking about streaming online, the first thing that pops into their head is live streaming, that we're just going to put a camera in the room and hit go live, and we're going to, run with it. I really kind of found 3 different ways that I think aren't ways that I invented. It's things that I saw, and I think it gives hope to smaller churches who don't have big budgets or fast internet or big staffs or whatever. But those 3 different ways. Pre-Bothand worship is the idea that you would pre-record your online experience of worship. So it's all recorded ahead of time. That allows you to make it a little shorter, talk directly to the camera. You don't have to think about 2 different audiences at the same time, but you're serving 2 different audiences. And audience is kind of a funny word when we're thinking about the church, but you've got your in-person congregation and those from your congregation who will worship online. I think of those as 2 audiences that are part of one congregation. The second form that I talk about is real-time Bothand worship, and that is the idea of live streaming. But even there, I think we have to make some adjustments so that we create a scenario where people both in the room and online all feel like they're the primary audience, not that any of them are an afterthought, not the people in the room or at home. And then the third option that I talk about in the book is what I call post-Bothand worship, and that's the idea that you would do what you do in the room, you would have cameras recording that thing that you do in the room, and then after the fact, you would edit and post it, and it would be more of a curated experience of worship rather than just what you're doing. And the beauty of these three models is that even if you don't have internet, you can't really do the real-time thing, but you could do pre-both and worship, or you could do post-both and worship, even if you don't have the ability to stream live because you don't have the bandwidth, or you're in the middle of nowhere or whatever.
So let's talk about some big shifts that happen within the church. So obviously the internet technology, the pandemic, all of that really helped us find new ways to share the Great Commission. So what are some things that you tackle in the book? What did you really set out to do in a way of, here are some things that we can do different to still succeed at the Great Commission?
One of the criticisms I often hear from folks is that online worship isn't really worship, or it doesn't really count, or if it's not embodied and we're not all in the space, that it's not real. And I think part of what I've wanted to do is help people see that there is a valid expression and form of worship that I think transcends technology. I make the point in the book that a move to fully embracing hybrid ministry is a move to embrace what the church has historically been. The church began as a hybrid ministry. Paul's ministry was hybrid. All throughout Acts, he's preaching to the people in person, and there's a lot of in-person things happening. And then he begins to write these letters, these epistles, and some of them were from prison and so on. Paul constantly says, "I long to be with you. I wish we were in person." But no one discounts that Paul's letters are valid. He's actually preaching and leading the church from those letters. He's giving them instruction. He's preaching to them. And so to really grab hold of the moment that we're living in, we can do things in a both-and way. Now, I call the training both and, not either or. I don't think online should replace in-person worship. But I do think that if we're intentional and we reimagine what worship is for this time that we're in, we actually have the ability to reach more people than ever before. I've had, as a result of the book and the trainings, I'm working with about 175 pastors a month through 16 cohort calls. So I lead these hour-long cohort calls. In fact, I did one right before we met today, and we've got one right after we're done here today. One of the things that I have been encouraging pastors to think about is, what is the discipleship or relational pathway that you are building into your building or into deeper discipleship through the worship that you do? And I think that we've got a lot more people paying attention than used to. Just about every group I talk to, I have pastors say, we have guests who are showing up in our buildings. We've got more visitors in the building than we've had in many years, and it's all happened because of our online worship. People are now checking us out online in a less vulnerable way, and some of them are migrating to the building. So I think there's a wonderful opportunity here. Let's also remember that at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came to reside within us. We didn't have to go to the temple to experience God, but God is everywhere in the presence of the Holy Spirit. And so we've said for a long time in the church that the church is not the building. And then in the last couple of years, we've put that to practice, or put that to a test. And I think some people have been very uncomfortable with the thought that, it really can't happen without the building. No, it is about the building, and I think there's some interesting dialogue and conversation happening there. So I think for me, the biggest thing is I just want people to experience and know that real transformation, real worship can happen through hybrid means.
So with that, I might ask you some questions that are tongue-in-cheek, or the stuff that I would have opinions on. But so I'll start with this. Should we place more attention on the in-person or the online? Which one should get preference?
I don't think you have to give preference to one or the other. I think you can do both, and that's why I wrote the book, quite honestly. There are some really low-hanging fruit opportunities that I share constantly in my coaching work. If I could get every church to just begin to think about three different audiences. You've got the people right now in the room. If you're live streaming, you've got the people right now at home. and then you've got the people who are worshiping with you at a later time online. So you've got right now in the room, right now at home, later online. And so much of our language just favors the people in the room. So we'll say things like, let's all stand together and sing. Well, at home, people in their living rooms are very likely not standing to sing. And I think it's just a little tip off to them that you're not thinking of them when you use language like that. So instead, you might say, if you're worshiping here in the building with us, I'm going to invite you to stand and sing. If you are worshiping with us at home, I want to invite you to find a posture that will allow you to fully participate in this moment. And that covers the people who are worshiping later too, that they would find a posture that would, I'm at home, I'm not going to stand up while I'm singing, but I might sit up a little bit. I might enter a more reverent and prayerful experience if I'm invited to do that. And then also just to remember that the instructions we give in the room don't make a whole lot of sense for those at home when we're doing things like communion, or sometimes we'll let people offer prayer requests and things like that. What happens when you say, if you've got a prayer request, just shout it out? Well, the people at home can't shout loud enough for you to hear them. So the other thing I would love to get people to do is just to remember the phrase or put it in the chat. And then you can also have someone that's monitoring the chat that could say, hey, we've got one here online from Carl. And he says, I'm praying for a friend who's, dealing with some hard things in their life right now. I think that it doesn't have to be either or. It can be both and.
So one thing that you said that I really liked in the book is that hybrid is where everyone feels like they are the primary audience. Yeah. That is truly both and, that we are crafting experiences for all audiences in mind when we craft it.
And if you think about it, we engage in this pretty regularly with our favorite sports. So football games, it's not just for the people in the stadium. You've got probably, I don't know how the numbers compare, but multiple times more people watching the game at home than are in the stadium. I mean, most of us will never get to experience a Super Bowl in the stadium in real time, But I mean, people have Super Bowl parties and friends get together, and there's a real connection to what's happening in that moment. And so if you ask the NFL who's the primary audience, they're not going to tell you the people in the stadium or the people at home. They want everybody to be the primary audience in that experience.
So you relate some of it to book to film too. Both of us are big film buffs. So kind of walk through that analogy of going from book to film and how that relates to in person and online.
Yeah. I never want it to sting, but I have to tell churches sometimes that the way they're defining hybrid is not really hybrid, because what they more or less have done is just put a camera in the back of the room and gone about business as usual. Put a camera in the balcony, put a camera in the back. Now we're doing hybrid worship. Well, not really. Hybrid is an experience where people both in the room and at home both feel like they're a part of it. So I have used the metaphor of book to film to kind of describe how you create an experience that is truly hybrid. One of the downsides of, what often happens when books become films is that people don't really like the film as much as they like the book. And I think that's sort of what's happened in some cases with worship, that we like the in-person experience more than the online. But I think there are some films that have kind of broken out and done better things because they've really reimagined the story in powerful ways. So Jurassic Park often is referenced as one of those good books, great film. Apparently Forrest Gump was a terrible book, but it was a really excellent. I've never read it.
Book. It's awful.
But the film is pretty incredible. Some folks say Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was a better film than book. I'll let others debate that. But when it comes to the worship that we do, number one, I think that we have to consolidate the story. You can't take a book that takes three days to read or whatever and turn it into a 3-day film. It has to become a 2-hour, 3-hour, they seem to be getting longer and longer.
Yeah, aren't they? Yeah.
But you have to consolidate. And I think that's true for worship as well. Online, you don't have a captive audience. and you don't have the ability to control the space that they're worshiping in. So when they're in the building, you get to control the seating, the lighting, the temperature, all those things at home. A full hour online doesn't work as well as it does in the building. And of course, context matters. Some churches go longer than that, some are shorter, whatever. But I referenced Nona Jones in the book. Back in 21, I did a training for online or digital church planters, and she was one of the speakers in addition to me. And when I wasn't speaking, I was learning. And Nona said the sweet spot is between 25 and 35 minutes. And when they look at, she works for Facebook, when they look at the numbers, people turn it off at about 40 minutes or so. In some cases, regardless of what's happening, like their threshold is 40 minutes and they'll turn it off in the middle of the sermon or whatever. So consolidate is number one. The second thing I think we have to do is adapt. So there are several practices we have to adapt. Music, I think, is one of those things that a lot of people don't sing at home in the same way they do in the building. I'm not suggesting we don't sing at all in our online worship, but I think we might truncate some of that. And I talk in the book about how to do that even when you do it in real time, where you don't have to compromise what's happening in the room, but you may do a little different online by staggering when you start your online experience. Things like offering. Giving is an act of worship, and you can't pass the plate to people at home. And so I think we've got to embrace digital giving, which nowadays seems to be pretty common, but pre-pandemic, I had a lot of people when I would coach and talk about that would really be resistant to the thought that they'd have to pay fees or whatever, didn't want to do online giving. I think we have to reimagine moments in worship like communion and baptism and, how do you do those kind of things? I don't have answers for all those things, but I think we have to acknowledge that we have to think about how we do those things differently. And then how do we embrace the limits of the new way that we're telling the story? I mean, there are certain things that you can do in person that you just really can't do in the same way at home. So how do we embrace those things and really lean into them? So that's kind of how I have thought about book. There's some other things about building community. I mean, great films have community that are built around them, and how do we build community out of what we're doing? And then of course there's a lot about how do you tell a story well. Camera needs to be closer to create intimacy and those sorts of things. But the book to film metaphor seems to be helpful in helping people reimagine how we do worship online and in the building.
So give me some more reasons why to keep it shorter. We talked about Nona's threshold of around 40 minutes is when people turn off. But there's some things that you go through in the book, like leaders are responding to screen fatigue. And so maybe there's some elements that are missing in a worship service, or less interaction, things like that. Give me some flesh that out a little bit on why we should keep it shorter.
Well, I mean, part of it is that the experience, just what you feel in your living room, is a little different than what you feel in the building. At home is not really a communal experience, and you feel something different in a communal experience than you do when you're worshiping in isolation, even if it's just you and your family. I've got a 13-year-old daughter and a 16-year-old son. And the hardest time when we are worshiping online to keep them in front of the television is during the singing portion of worship. I don't know if it's like self-consciousness about not wanting to be heard by your sister, your brother, your parents singing or whatever. The weird thing is when we're in the building, they'll sing right along. They have no issues with that. But I think part of it is you're having a communal experience and your voice is joined with other voices and it's just a different kind of thing. So, those are issues. I do think that there is a bit of that screen fatigue that we feel, and the longer it goes, the idea of one more sitting in front of our computers or our TV screens or whatever for a meeting, even though it's worship, maybe more than people can handle, I think. I think distractions, get in the way. You have a more distraction-free zone in church than you do at home. So, right. While I'm worshiping online, especially if I'm worshiping in your service and it's on Facebook, I'll start getting private messages in the middle of worship. Right. Someone might ring my doorbell. My dog needs to go out. I can go get as many cups of coffee as I want, all of those kind of things. And so I think distractions. So, shorter in terms of the worship experience online is better, just because I think we have attention spans that are very different in a less controlled environment.
I agree. So let's walk through, you used Jimmy Fallon in The Tonight Show as an example of how he went from, obviously what he normally does into an at-home experience and then kind of back in gradually. Walk me through that and how you're using that to show churches how they can come back.
I think Jimmy Fallon was a really excellent example of how to pivot well and how to live in the moment we're in and not try and pretend like it's not happening. I think for some churches, it's like we want to pretend like the pandemic never happened, or we have the same expectations for people today as we did in 2019, and we're living in a very different world because of the pandemic than we once were. So, in my training, I show these 3 clips from The Tonight Show. First one is Tonight Show pre-pandemic, and if it's everything you remember, Jimmy comes out, 3-piece suit and tie, curtain opens, the Roots play, there's an audience that is completely full, all of those typical things that we knew pre-pandemic. And then the next clip I show is Jimmy at home, and one of my favorite segments when he was at home was when he would do thank you cards. And so he'd have his 2 daughters in the shot sometimes when he would do these things. His wife was running the camera. In the clip I show, he is in his backyard in a tent, and his 2 daughters are with him. They're completely distracted. He starts doing thank you cards, and his one daughter has printed out graphics. So what would come up on the screen were just printed out on 8.5 by 11 paper, and his daughter's holding them up and not doing a great job of meeting all the cues. His other daughter is running the thank you music that they play on the piano off of an iPad, and she can't get it quite right, and sometimes she hits the button too many times. Jimmy is completely like losing it, cracking up. He can't get his jokes out. You can hear his wife behind the camera laughing. And for me, it was some of the most compelling stuff I had seen on The Tonight Show, because he had really acknowledged where we were at in that moment. And so as I think about pastors, leaders who had to do worship from their living rooms, I think some of them felt like, oh my gosh, we're nowhere near as elegant as, Life Church, or or we can't do what Elevation does, or, whatever. Like, we don't have the skills, the crew, the equipment. I have to constantly remind people that authenticity is more important than being slick or perfect. And I think what we saw in those moments with Jimmy was that authenticity really was more important than being slick, and it was really compelling. And so the third clip I show is the first week Jimmy came back. I think it was like the show on the Friday of the first week of his return. And it's a very different show at that moment. The intro is like more meandering, kind of jazzy kind of thing. He's walking through the city of New York to the studio. He's got his mask on. He comes in, they're rolling the chairs away. There's nobody in the audience. The band is actually separated on 2 levels. They're all socially distanced. And the studio now looks more like a New York apartment or something, rather than this big fancy studio with the curtain and all of that. He's wearing like a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and a jacket over top of it, but not the suit and tie. And he comes out and sits on a stool, and it's very, very casual. And while I'm showing this, I always ask in the chat for people to give real-time reflections on what they're seeing. And people recognize that it's less polished, it's less produced, it acknowledges where things were at the time. And my point in showing this is that I think many of us, when the buildings reopen, wanted to rush back to 2019 and pretend like we weren't still in a pandemic, or like the pandemic hadn't happened. And I really think it would be jarring for us to go from you're worshiping online on Zoom or whatever your church is doing to like, okay, our building's back open. Let's just revert all the way back to where we were at in 2019. So I make the point through those clips and just in the book that we need to iterate forwards rather than revert backwards. My old boss at the mega church I served at back in the 90s and early 2000, Mike Slaughter used to say that if you put it up for a vote, the people will always vote to go back to Egypt. And I think that's what some people have done, is that when the buildings were allowed to reopen, we just said, let's go back to where things were in worship pre-pandemic. And in doing that, what we ended up doing was we created observers or spectators for people at home because, pre-pandemic, we would talk to the room mostly and we'd say, thanks for coming. And then we might look at the camera for 1 second and say, and if you're worshiping with us online, thanks for coming today. And then we'd go back to talking to the room for an hour. Well, after a year or year and a half or however long your church was closed, where we were talking directly to people at home, I think it's jarring to go backwards. And so what I have encouraged folks to do is to look at, what did you do in 2019 that still works in 22 after a pandemic? And we're not quite out of it, but hopefully we're getting close. And then what did you do in 20 when you were all at home and nobody was in the building? Your worship shouldn't look like that today either, because you've got people in the room now. What does the next iteration look like? We should not settle for the captivity of the past, but it should instead walk into the promised land and lean into this new reality, which, as you mentioned a moment ago, is a great commission opportunity that we can take the gospel to people everywhere.
Yeah. I loved how you used the Tonight Show. I was also using, at the time, John Krasinski from The Office would do these little news segments. Remember that?
Yeah.
And multiple, at-home versions of shows. And that was, version 1 is better than version none, right? Get it out there.
Yes.
Doesn't have to be super polished and whatever. But I think you make a good point that what is the pathway back look like? Do we come full back to 100% where we were? Is there some type of mixture of the two? What does hybrid really look like? Okay, so let's get into. We'll be pretty quick on these, but let's get into pre and real time and post a little bit more. So talk to me again about pre, both, and worship. This means worship that is held at two separate experiences. One is the room, and another is produced for online only, right?
Yes. So if you are a church that really would like to go back to 2019, this would be probably the best model of all for you, because I see it as two separate experiences. What you do in the room, you can more or less do what you always did, and there aren't even cameras in the room. You're not broadcasting from the room. You're giving an experience to the people in the room, which means that it is 100% focused on the people in the room. And then is that you're creating an experience that is pre-recorded, that is for an online-only audience, which means that you can look at the camera the entire time. You don't have to split your attention. You can create an experience that is a little shorter. Your singing, you might include 1 or 2 songs rather than 3 or 4 or 5 or how many songs you would do in your live experience. I've encouraged pastors to think about creating the TED Talk version of their sermon. TED Talks are 18 minutes or less. I think in the room, you can get away with 25 or 30 minutes or longer in some contexts, But online, I just think that our attention spans are different. And then what does it look like to invite people into further relationship or give them a call to action as part of that experience of worship that is pre-recorded, where you say, so here's what's next. Maybe you can get involved in a Bible study online or in the building. I think we all ought to be making pitches every week online. We're glad to have you online, but we'd also love to meet you someday right here in the building and chat in that way.
Do you feel like it's that online is solely for the purpose of giving people a taste and moving them to the in-person experience? Or do you think that do you want people to stay online and only be online if they could make it to in-person? Follow me?
See, I totally get what you're saying. For me, I think it's a both and, quite honestly. I don't think that I think someone can have an online experience of worship, and it can really be an experience of worship, and it's not just a shuttle to the building. It's not that we're only trying to get them to the building. I do think that for some people, the experience in the building is going to be more meaningful. It's going to be deeper. I also think there are some people that will never, ever walk in the building. And so the online experience means something to them. I have a friend in North Carolina, a pastor friend that I've been coaching for a couple of years now, who told me that at the beginning of the pandemic, or right before the pandemic, he had reconnected with a friend of his in Florida who he had grown up with. And he said, oh, yeah, I'm a pastor now, and all those things. And then when the pandemic hit, they went online, and he's like, you ought to attend our worship online. So this person from Florida started worshiping online with them every week and was very inspired by what they experienced. And so they started giving offering pretty regularly. And then they thought, I'm being so fed by this church, I'm going to start tithing. And so she started giving 10% of her income to the church. And then when they started doing online Bible study, she was like, I'm in. So she started coming to every Bible study online that they would do in Zoom. And the pastor said, you are more committed than some of my people here in the building. He said, you ought to just join our church. And she's like, okay, can I do that? And he's like, yes. And so for the first time ever, they did a membership Sunday where they had 3 or 4 people standing up front and a TV on a cart with Zoom. And she took her membership vows from Florida. She's not moving to North Carolina, but she's joining the church. And she's found ways to serve locally in her community. So she's hooked up with some other churches where she, works in a soup kitchen and does some other things. And now she is the leader of their online greeting team. So she organizes other people to make sure they have greeters in the chat and all those kind of things. So for me, it's like, that doesn't make her less valid because she didn't come to the building. She's just as much a part of that church, and her faith is as active as someone in the building. And let's just be honest, Carl, there are some people who come to the building and are watchers of worship, and they don't ever really put into practice what they're hearing. And so I get excited by the thought that it can be both and. That yes, some people, we hope to migrate them from online into the building, but I also think that if we're doing the work of reimagining ministry for an online audience, I've got one friend that I write about in the book who is the chapel online. She's working with people in 34 countries right now, and it's all online. And I mean, they've got tithers and people who show up to Bible study and participate in their prayer ministry, and real discipleship is happening all through digital means.
I think if you had to pin me down, this is probably my favorite model because you're crafting the experience for the targeted audience, meaning the in-person experience is crafted and executed for that audience, and the online can be packaged just like Jimmy Fallon at home. That was not a live stream. That was a recorded, packaged delivery to an online audience. And therefore you could put, if YouTube is your, main vehicle, then you could do chapter markers. You can do, timeline things. You can have specific things in the video. Like my friend Rack, he's on our team, and he's the creative director for Epic Church in Philadelphia as well. And they do this model. And it's little countdowns in the corner to the next segment on a lower third. It's talking directly to that audience. I mean, it is really crafted for the online audience. And so I would say that this is probably my favorite because you're being very specific about what audience you're trying to reach.
I think there's a ton of advantage to this particular one for sure. And I would also add, just because we didn't hit it, you can even do kind of asynchronous participation even if you pre-record. So there's a pastor that I write about in the book from Wisconsin who said, I'm going to just ask right now, what is something you're thankful for? And they're pre-recording. So she's, I'm going to light this candle, and I want you just to respond in the chat. I'm actually in the chat with you right now. as you're watching this, if you're watching when we air it live. So let's go ahead and share something we're thankful for. And she lit a candle, and the camera's on the candle. And someone said, I love fresh strawberries. And someone else said, oh, I love strawberries too. And someone said, I have a great strawberry pie recipe. And the pastor said, oh, I would like that recipe. And this whole thing happened in 30 seconds where they were all interacting and engaged with one another, even though it was pre-recorded. So I think we can even have opportunity for people to dialogue in those moments.
Yep, I agree. All right, so let's hit on real-time both-and worship. This is what we would consider live streaming. So walk me through a couple advantages and disadvantages of this model.
Well, as far as participation goes, this is my favorite model for real-time interaction if pastors and leaders will lean into it, meaning that you can ask a question and get response right away, and you can have a dialogue with people in real time. This is where I mentioned the metaphor of the football game. The people at the stadium are giving a great experience to the people who are attending at the stadium, and the people in the production trucks and behind the cameras are focused 100% on those at home. See, I think most of us don't think in those terms. We're just creating an experience for the room, and we have cameras pointed at the room, and we're inviting people at home to watch what's happening in the room. And that's not what happens when you watch football.
Yeah, let me
go ahead.
Let me throw a timeout here, and say that I'm sure in those pre-planning meetings, those teams are together. How are we going to craft this whole experience that encompasses who is there and who is online, and then, or who is watching the broadcast, and then those teams are have smaller meetings to talk about how they're going to reach their specific audiences there. Did I explain that right? Does that make sense? Do you agree with that? That in the pre-planning,
Absolutely.
It's how do we reach everybody?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, a little later in the book, I talk about the idea of assigning advocates for both the in-person experience and the online experience.
Right.
And I think those are the people that are in those conversations where you're dreaming up the whole thing. And then some of them are saying, yeah, but how's this going to make sense for online?
Right.
And some are going to say, wait a minute. If we
and
do
you need that
that's
advocate there. You need an online campus pastor, something that can go, hang on, that is not going to work for online experience.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that. Yeah, because I actually, in some of the work I do, I coach churches that do two different styles of worship. So one might be a very traditional service, and one might be a non-traditional. I hate the word contemporary. And I believe you can plan series together with that whole team, and then figure out, okay, so which of these pieces belongs in our traditional and which belongs in our non-traditional, which belong in both, and which, what things are going to get segmented. But I also think that works for online. So yeah, it's a great point. I'm glad you made that. And I would assume that there's probably some level of conversation that happens with a venue and a broadcast team, when you're talking about a football game or whatever. I'm certainly the people that are running the stadium are in conversation with the crews, and they probably figured out, they work timeouts and things like that in a way that work for the physical space and the online as well. So that's where I first talk about that. There are a few things that I think are really important for us to consider when it comes to delivering an experience that feels like everyone's primary. The first is dealing with time. Most churches that I've talked to over the last 3 years are typically doing about an hour or so worship experience. Some traditions go longer than that. Of course, in the African American tradition, sometimes it's 2 hours. But generally speaking, what I found is most churches are doing about an hour in person. And then I go back to Nona's recommendations of about 40 minutes. And so how can you do real time and deliver both those things at the same time? I talk about two different models that I've seen that work to a varying degree, depending on how much effort you put into it. First one I call split the difference, and that's the idea that you might instead do a 50-minute service rather than an hour, and then you're kind of splitting the difference between the two. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this particular model. I've seen a lot of churches use it where they just do a shorter than normal worship service. The reason I think it's a little bit challenging is that, number one, the people that actually got up and got dressed and want to be in the building,
Kind of cheating him a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, I went to all this effort. Like, I don't want you to cut it short. I showed up today. So honor that, So you might get some complaints there from those folks. The people at home who have a 40-minute threshold are not going to complain when you go longer than 40 minutes. They're just going to turn it off when they've had as much as they can stomach for being at home. And that's not everybody. I mean, we have some people that will watch the entire thing no matter what. But I have had churches tell me we've used this model and it seems to work. So I don't ever want to discount someone's experience. The second model that I talk about that a lot of the churches I coach have had some real wins around is what I call the staggered approach. And that might be, you might have to rearrange your worship a little to make this work, but that's where before the online starts, the in-person worship experience starts. So let's say at 10 a.m., we welcome everybody who's in the room. You're not even looking at the camera because the camera's not on yet. Welcome to worship. We're glad you're here. We're in our series called, and you set up your series and you do all that kind of stuff. And you say, let's stand together and worship the God who, whatever. And so you begin to worship. And let's say you're going to sing 4 or 5 songs. Let's say you're going to sing 5 songs. I don't know if that's a lot or little in your church, but one of the churches I went to is often like 4 or 5 songs up front. Let's say that when you get to song number 4, after song number 4, you start the online broadcast, but you'd have to do it the same way every week. So at 10:15 or 10:10 or whatever that times out to, and again, it would have to be consistent. You're gonna start the online broadcast. So at the end of song number 4, the leader would then say, "Let's pray." Well, there's 3 different ways that I recommend doing this. Way number 1 is that the leader at the end of song number 4, if you don't have the technology to do so, you hit go live, and that person then, instead of talking to the crowd, talks to the camera and says, "We want to welcome those of you who are joining us for our online worship. We are so glad you're here today. We're in a series about," and you set that up, and then you say, "Let's worship now the God who is," whatever you want to say that transition line is. And then they sing the 5th song, but for the online audience, it's going to be the 1st song. And it may be the only song that you sing online. So way number 1 is that. It's a little weird because the room just heard you say all that stuff before. But I've heard churches do this, and your people get used to it. The second way would be to pre-record that intro. And instead, when the 4th song comes to its completion, I, as the worship leader, say, "Let's pray." And I close my eyes and we begin to pray, except I keep one eye open and I'm watching in the back because you have just hit play on a video where I have welcomed everyone. "Hey, good morning. Welcome to worship. I'm Jason, and we are worshiping today in our series called blah, blah, blah." And I've created a 30-second recorded intro, but the other person is up here praying with an eye open. 5, 4, 3... And amen. Let's continue our worship now. And then we're in sync. So the online got a greeting from a video, and then we are singing together song number 5. And our worship now has 10 minutes cut off the front of it, or 15 minutes. The third option is to have somebody do what I just mentioned live from another place in the building. So if you're in a more technically proficient church, somebody who knows technology well, you and I both know that somebody can be in another room with wireless technology and good communication. So when song number 4 comes to its end, person on the stage is preaching. The other person is live in front of a camera and says, "Good morning. Welcome. I see in the chat, Carl, you're with us today." And you can actually do it live in the moment and say, "We're in a series called blah, 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 and let's continue to sing." And then we cut back to the room, and now we're in sync. So there are 3 different ways to do that. And then the middle of the service is all basically in sync, online and in person all together. And then at the end, maybe after the sermon, you might then dismiss the people online, so that you have an opportunity to say goodbye to them rather than just letting them fizzle out. So maybe after the sermon, you say, hey, if you're worshiping with us online, thanks for worshiping with us today. We're going to continue here in the building. You're welcome to hang around as long as you'd like, but we're going to continue to sing and share some of the announcements, whatever you do in that moment. But basically, you pocket a 40-minute experience in a full hour, and they're with you kind of for the middle. And then the other stuff at the end is really more for the room than it is for the people online, although they're welcome to hang around if they want to. I'll just quickly say, I'll liken this to what they did at my church just recently. They had a moment at the end of worship where people were allowed to come up and pray. And it was the service time was pretty much done. And they didn't want to keep everybody in the room. They didn't want people in the room to feel awkward because they wanted to get up and leave because there were a line of people up front that wanted to pray. So they just said, hey, friends, we are going to continue here in our prayer service. If you'd like to pray, go ahead and come on up, but we're going to dismiss the rest of you. Hey, thanks for coming. We'll see you again next week. And that meant that we could leave and the people that wanted to pray could stay. And I think that's kind of what I'm saying here is that the in-person room would continue kind of the natural progression of the hour, and those at home would have the opportunity to kind of bow out in that moment if they wanted to.
Yeah, good. All right, let's hit on post Bothand worship really quickly. This is recorded live, then played back later. It's really an on-demand experience.
Yes. There's a church here that I write about in the book here in Ohio called Farmersville. I always say their name tells you everything you need to know about them. They don't have fast internet in their building. They are not a big church. They don't have a huge technical team, but they record a few things earlier in the week. So the announcements, maybe one or two other things for their worship. And then on Sunday morning at 9 a.m., everybody comes to the building. They worship from 9 to 9:50 or so. It's about a 50-minute service. And as soon as that worship is over, they take the recording, they take the sermon, they take a couple of songs, and they put them all into the video editor where they had the other stuff they pre-recorded. I think they have to actually drive into the city because they don't have fast enough internet. And then they upload it, and by 11 a.m., you can worship with them online. So you can either come to the 9 o'clock live in the room, or you can go to the 11 o'clock online. And as far as the people who are worshiping online know, they know it's recorded. They don't even think about the fact that it was just an hour and a half, 2 hours ago that this actually happened. That might be a little aggressive for some churches. So I see some churches doing more of a delayed approach. So we just stagger it by 1 week. So we record it this Sunday and air it next Sunday. And it's only a problem the first Sunday. And then after that, you're a little out of sync. I have also seen churches take their hour-long experience of worship that they're streaming live and create more of what I would call a curated experience of that worship. So on Sunday morning, we're streaming it live, and then afterwards, we're going to edit it down to be more of a 30-minute service that people will engage with throughout the week. So that's another option that I think has value.
All right, so as our time wraps up, I got a couple more questions for you, and then I want to play a quick trivia game with you. All right. So let's hit on the why. So in the book, you talk about Simon Sinek, and man, that is the Start With Why stuff is incredible. I interviewed like his right-hand guy right when that kind of came out, and just the stuff that they put out as far as knowing your why and going after it is really good. So let's hit on that for a second. Tell me the why of hybrid worship. Give me some reasons.
Well, I think the why drives our what and our how, as you said. And I have a part 2 training that I do called Bothand To Be Continued, where I make the argument that we've got to continue this even if the pandemic ends tomorrow. And I show a clip from comedian Michael Jr., where he talks about the importance of the why, has a man in the audience who sings Amazing Grace, and then he gives him some parameters. I want you to do it like you were shot. You got shot in the back when you were a kid. Your uncle just got out of jail. Let me hear the hood version. And everything changes because the second time he knew why he was doing it, and his what and his how was really augmented. So I think every church has to ask that question for themselves. I do outline in the book 13 reasons that I think we need to continue. And I don't know if I am all in my head, but starting with some people who have come back Some people have come back because of both and or hybrid worship. People have left the church, left your church. They've migrated back because it was easier to come online. Maybe there was an awkward thing that happened somewhere along the way. They got in a conflict or whatever and didn't feel comfortable coming back, and they connected online. The second thing that I talk about is are those people who feel shunned by the church. Maybe they don't have nice enough clothes, or they have too many tattoos, or whatever reason. I had a brother-in-law who used to say, if I walked into church, God would strike me down with lightning. Just doesn't feel comfortable in a church building. Some of those people have connected with us online because it's less vulnerable. The third group that I always think about are shut-ins. Shut-ins have had the most incredible 3 years almost now of worship that a lot of them didn't ever receive pre-pandemic, because the best we could do was send them a bulletin or a printed sermon or an audio CD or something like that. One of my favorite stories that someone told me was a church that adopted a nursing home, and they bought them a large screen TV. They hooked it up to the internet. They stream on YouTube, and all they have to do is turn on the YouTube channel, and on Sunday morning, all of the residents come and watch worship. He said, we've come to think of them as our second campus, and we write them letters and we visit and all those things. Another church told me about how they're ministering to incarcerated people. And so they actually, at the end of their worship, they set up a microphone and camera, and 10 minutes after worship finishes, they leave the stream going, and family members and friends can come and speak into that microphone. It's one-way communication, but they get to minister to, really, those people in prison. And they said it's actually grown their church, that people have started coming to their church to come to worship so that afterwards they can share those words with those inmates. I think about vacationing families. The blue laws that used to exist in our country that protected Sundays as sort of a day separate and apart, where stores were closed and things, those don't exist anymore. So now a family can go to a soccer game or a gymnastics meet or be on vacation and still worship. Worship lives beyond Sunday or whatever day you do it. Now we archive those things, and someone can be just as moved by your sermon a year from the day you preach it as they are on the day that you preach it. I think about geography doesn't matter anymore. And so we have people worshiping from other states, other cities, other countries. I mean, that's pretty incredible as well. I love that we now can dialogue in the worship that we do. So there's a back and forth. I have a special needs child, and I got to tell you what a blessing hybrid worship is when you have a child who's maybe having a difficult day. Pre-pandemic, if we were having a rough day in the morning and our church didn't broadcast worship, we just had to miss church. And on days where we're having a rough day, we can still worship online, still be a part of our church, and hope that next week is going to be a little bit better. Introverts, people with social anxiety, who have a hard time getting out in front of crowds and things, they get a respite. They can still worship from home. I don't think you should always worship from home, but on those weeks they need that break, they can have it. I think about those with visual and hearing impairments who can't hear or see very well. One of my favorite stories was about a woman who would sit in the front row at her church. She is an elderly woman who can't hear very well. She comes every week to see her, quote, family. She sits in the front row with her phone in front of her, has the captions turned on so she can read the captions as the pastor is preaching, but stay connected to the people in her church. And so it's her both and that's happening right in the building. And then the last reason I think that I talk about, I don't know if I hit all 13 of them or not, was that it ain't over till it's over. And unfortunately, the pandemic is not quite over. I think last summer we thought going into the summer that it was pretty much over, and then Omicron and Delta popped up and we found ourselves in a sticky situation again. And I would just hate to think that we would end what we're doing, forget our why, and go back to the old way, and then find ourselves in a more restricted environment again. I don't know that they'll ever shut us down like they did, but we want to keep ministering this way. So it's a Great Commission moment. I think that's a good why as well. So
I would definitely go ahead.
I was going to say, there's just a quick bullet list.
Yeah, I agree with all those, man, and why those are reasons we should continue no matter what. I think pandemic or not, we need to have those experiences on the ready for the people that you just mentioned. Have those experiences available to them. Well, man, I would definitely encourage everybody to go pick up the book. It's on Amazon, wherever books are sold, Both and. Fantastic book, man. You did such a great job with it.
Thank you, Carl.
All right. Can I play a game with you before you leave?
You can. I just got to say, it's always so much fun talking to you. I can't believe it went so fast. I'm happy to do some trivia.
I know, man. I know. This is I could talk to you all day. All right, so these are 5 random trivia questions. Some of them are going to pertain to the content. Some of them are going to be way out of the blue. Okay?
Okay.
All right, here we go. Number 1, this would be 5. What is the number 1 most common thing that you see when doing worship experience audits that you suggest to churches to change almost immediately? Number 1 common thing.
Number 1 thing is do introductions. People online are a mystery to outsiders, and seemingly random people get up and start talking, and you don't know if they're a layperson, a pastor, staff, volunteer. So I encourage every church to make sure that everyone that has a speaking role in worship says who they are.
Very good. Number 2, we're both huge 80s and movie buffs. What was the highest grossing movie of the 80s?
Man, well, I would think that's a great question. 80s. Was it E.T.?
That is correct. That is correct.
All right.
That is correct. Very good. Very good. Very good. All right. Number 3, you're a big SNL fan. Yep. I'm a fan from the late 80s, early 90s. All right. So I'm going to hit you with trivia here. All right. Tell me the full sentence that Dana Carvey and Kevin Nealon would say when they start Hans and Franz sketches.
I am Hans and I am Franz, and we are here to pump you up.
That is correct. That is correct. Right. Very good. Very good. All right. Back to the Future trivia. What was the name of George McFly's novel?
A Match Made in Space.
Wow. I just can't stump him. All right, number 5. We'll go back to your both and content. Here we go. What is one thing that you don't want churches to retreat back into now that we're pretty much post-pandemic? What's the worst thing that they could not learn from?
Yes. I think for me, there are 2 that are competing in my head. I would say the number 1 is just to not forget eye contact. I think that eye contact means so much to people at home, and we did eye contact very well throughout the pandemic because we looked right at the camera, and that felt good when you're at home. You could feel a difference. And now that we've got people in the room, we've just basically turned to talking to people in the room. And when you do that, you just make people at home spectators. I'll say a close second is the practice of greeting people in service, where we go and we shake hands and we talk to everybody. My wife, who's an introvert, that is excruciating for her, and she has been so grateful that ended. But she's concerned it's coming back. I think part of it is, passing around germs or whatever. That has nothing to do. She's an introvert. That's uncomfortable for her. But just to remember that people at home want to be acknowledged too. So if you're going to do a greeting time, have people turn around and wave at the camera, or greet them in the chat or whatever. Just remember that when you say, let's all greet each other now, you're really kind of excluding those who are not in the room that can participate in that way. So
I think that brings up just an overarching point, is to be intentional. Know who your audience is and be intentional about crafting experiences for those for that audience.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, man, thank you so much for your time. You're the man. We could talk for days on this, and we do sometimes.
We do. We do. I'm hoping my work takes me back to Columbia so we can hang out again.
I know, man. All right. Thank you so much, buddy.
All right. Thanks, Carl.
guys, when it comes to presenting lyrics on screen to your congregation, nothing is worse than being late on lyrics. It halts the worship of your people. So let me give you a quick rule of thumb when it comes to leading lyrics on screen, whether you're presenting full screen lyrics or lower thirds. Advance to the next slide when your worship leader sings the next to last word on the slide. I found that no matter the tempo of the song, if you give this rule of thumb to your volunteers, it gives them consistency in knowing when to advance the slide as opposed to feeling it out. Now you can fudge a little bit if you know the song really well, but that's my rule of thumb when it comes to leading lyrics in your worship experience.
The show notes for this episode are available now at makingsundayhappen.com.
Next week on the podcast, I'll welcome church audio master James Attaway. James is a YouTuber and teaches tech leaders a clear path for taking your church sound team to the next level, eliminating distractions and making every worship mix enjoyable. I'll talk with James next week about how to train and lead your church sound team. That's next week. If you haven't joined or subscribed to our YouTube channel or followed us on social media, please do so. We would love to connect with you on the socials, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. Lots of great content and free resources all over the socials as well. We'll go out there and create some incredible worship experiences this weekend. I'll catch you next week.
Making Sunday Happen is a production of the ministry of 1230 Media. For show notes, archive episodes, and more free resources for your church, visit makingsundayhappen.com.